America is a nation afflicted and its temperature is rising.
Stop! Get in the car! Stop!
Now protesters demanding an end to the lockdowns are coming heavily armed.
Who brings guns? Are you threatening him?
The protests are small but widespread, grassroots but orchestrated nationally by groups with shady links to politics and business, like Freedom Works, which helped launch the Tea Party movement.
There's dark money coming in from major wealthy donors and from some business groups.
Some healthcare workers have tried to stop them going ahead.
It's ridiculous to sit here and tell me that I have to move because you're out here debating.
But every day the president spurs them on.
I don't know whether very many of these people would actually be out there if President Trump was not encouraging it.
The way they've lived, it's not great, it's terrible. Maybe the first 3 days, and then all of a sudden, you see what's going on. They want to get going.
The vast majority of voters, Republican and Democrat, accept the restrictions are necessary.
Nobody disagrees that we want to get out of this situation. Nobody. You don't need protests to convince anyone in this country that we have to get back to work.
But as the food lines get longer, the push to reopen for business is growing. The loudest call to open for business is coming from the president, and some states are starting to respond. Texas, Tennessee, Georgia and South Carolina are all easing restrictions. All are led by Republican governors. Every recovery is cause for cheer. This New Jersey facility notching up 800 healthy patients discharged, a rare positive milestone worth celebrating. David Lipson, ABC News, Washington.
Let's get more on this, and we're joined by the host of Planet America, John Barron. John, good to talk to you. So, how large are these protests, and who are the protesters?
They vary greatly, Andrew, and obviously in many cases they're amplified by the proximity of cable news cameras that can make a group of 50 people look like a massive protest. But in the last few hours, in places like Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, there was around 1,000, by some estimates, people protesting. In other cases, in places like Annapolis in Maryland, there were maybe 20 protesters turning up. And of course, in every crowd, be it 20 or 1,000, you could have 20 or 1,000 different reasons for being there. In some cases, they're religious extremists. In other cases, they are gun rights activists. In other cases, they are libertarians who simply don't believe the government should be telling people they have to stay in their homes. It was, however, Andrew, the president himself in those tweets last week, when he called on states to liberate their people, who drew the connection with gun rights. He made specific reference to the Second Amendment rights, which he believes are being impinged in the state of Virginia because they've banned you buying more than one handgun per month as one of their new gun control measures. And as a result, we are seeing a lot of these protesters turning up with guns and NRA hats as well as Trump banners and so on.
It's almost as if the president's having a bet either way, saying, yeah, we want more freedom, you should protest against these lockdowns, but then at the same time saying, well, these lockdowns are necessary for the moment.
Absolutely right, Andrew. Back in the late 1940s, Harry Truman, the president, had a sign on his desk saying the buck stops here. Well, the president today has passed the buck to the states, saying it's not going to be up to us to decide when to reopen the states. It'll be up to the state governors. Now, that's a fairly responsible thing. But when he then says, and it's therefore their fault when the states remain shut down at the best medical advice, that's where the president is trying to win the politics of this, telling his supporters who are angry about being kept in there, who've been watching Fox News for 2 months, telling them that maybe the virus isn't that bad, maybe it is just like the flu after all. Well, he's trying to shore up their support, and he's ginning up these issues around gun rights as well, to try and inflame the situation and make political advantage from it.
Yes, so are these protests resonating with the average American more broadly? Because some polling suggests that a majority of Americans at least do support the restrictions that are in place at the moment.
You're absolutely right. There's a partisan divide. 95% of Democrats support these shelter-in-home measures at the moment. Around 70% of Republicans agree. But like all of us, after 2, 3, 4 or more weeks, it starts to become, you get a little bit stir-crazy, and there's a lot of people that would like to be able to move out as soon as possible to restart the economy, to go back to their jobs and so on. But right now, it is only a vocal minority that are going to these protests and demanding that the states reopen. But in some states, as you mentioned, Georgia, Texas and others, the governors are listening, and they're going to be opening up restaurants and movie theatres and barber shops and bowling alleys within the week.
Now, John, I know you closely follow President Trump's Twitter feed, and I noticed that he's just tweeted about a suspension of immigration to the United States. What's he had to say?
Yeah, it's just come through, Andrew. He says, in light of the attack from the invisible enemy, as he's been describing COVID-19, as well as the need to protect the jobs of our great American citizens, I will be signing an executive order to temporarily suspend immigration into the United States. Now, that is a significant announcement. There are more than 1 million legal immigrants into the United States in the average year. However, with the current travel restrictions, you could also say this is largely a symbolic gesture, because immigration has effectively come to a halt right now with the quarantine restrictions and the travel restrictions from most of the world coming into the United States. But like that gun control issue, this is another example of the president stirring up his base, the anti-immigrant sentiment that exists in some of his Republican base. Will be very happy to see this, even if it doesn't have a major material impact. We'll just have to wait and see how it plays out, though, as this is breaking news.
John, good to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, sir.
India and Singapore have recorded their largest single-day spikes in coronavirus cases as restrictions are eased after a month of one of the world's toughest lockdowns. India's government allowed some manufacturing and agricultural activity to resume. COVID-19 cases jumped by 1,500 in a day, raising total infections to more than 18,000, with nearly 600 people having died. Singapore also confirmed a record daily jump as nearly 1,500 people tested positive, many of them foreign workers living in cramped dormitories. It now has the highest number of cases of the disease in Southeast Asia, despite having contained the first wave of infections. And across the world, some countries are taking the first steps towards lifting lockdown and restrictions as the rate of infection appears to slow. In Germany, some small shops have reopened, while Denmark and Norway have begun opening their schools. New Zealand has also announced that rules on local travel will be relaxed.
Even when the worst seems to be over, the virus remains a threat. In China, the authorities are still on their guard, checking for fever, a common symptom of COVID-19. Every government is now trying to work out what to do next. New Zealand is held up as an example of a country that's got it right so far. It cut itself off from the rest of the world. An extreme lockdown was introduced rapidly, and cases and deaths have been kept unusually low. So the Prime Minister has announced the first cautious moves to open up.
We believe that decisive action, going hard and going early, gave us the very best chance of stamping out the virus. And it has. We have done what very few countries have been able to do. We have stopped a wave of devastation.
In Europe, Germany is seen as a model for how to handle the virus. It's leading the way in testing. In Munich, this team is checking 1,000 people for antibodies to discover who's been infected. Right from the start, mass tests were seen as vital, and now, like in New Zealand, there's a first step to reopening. Julia Gless runs a shop in Heidelberg. Closed for weeks, she's now got permission to start again. This time from behind a protective screen, and with only one customer allowed in at a time.
Do you think it's the right time in Germany for shops like yours to reopen?
Yes, I think so, because if we couldn't do that, it would be very, very difficult to exist. It's maybe more important for the small businesses.
But what's happening in Japan shows the risk of easing measures too soon. Controls were introduced, but then relaxed, only for cases to rise sharply again. And the World Health Organization is warning countries against moving before they're fully prepared.
Please make sure you've got the defences in place at the community level. Please make sure that everybody knows that what their responsibility is. Please make sure that older people are given special care and attention. Please make sure that hospitals are got ready.
Japan's hospitals are now struggling. They're short of personal protective equipment. The government there is accused of assuming they'd got the outbreak under control.
The top stories on ABC News. Virgin Australia has gone into voluntary administration after the government rejected a plea for a $1.4 billion bailout. The government says it's up to big shareholders to bail out the airline. And if they fail to do so, private equity should be given a chance at the airline. The airline's chief executive, Paul Scurrah, says it was a necessary decision prompted by the unprecedented global pandemic. Restrictions on elective surgeries are expected to be eased when National Cabinet meets today, with the priority to be low-risk, high-benefit procedures. Non-urgent elective surgeries were cancelled last month to preserve resources, including personal protective equipment, and help the health system prepare for the influx of COVID-19 patients. 49 Ruby Princess crew members from 6 countries will finally be allowed off the cruise ship to fly home. More than 1,000 crew members remain on the vessel docked at Port Kembla, south of Sydney. The ship is expected to leave on Thursday. And the futures price for US oil has plunged into negative territory for the first time in history, with sellers offering buyers money to take their supplies next month. But much of the global economy suspended due to the coronavirus. Demand for crude has dried up, creating a global supply glut. Now let's return to our top story and take a look at